the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. A week ago, the Dearborn City Council moved its meeting to the public library because they expected a crowd. Police were outside in riot gear. Wayne County sent officers on horses. By the next morning, 22 people had been arrested from across Michigan and from as far as New York and Tennessee. Mayor Abdullah Hammoud told the council his own daughter didn't go to daycare that day. Some businesses stayed closed. Sports practices were rescheduled. What brought all this on was a man with a megaphone who told the council that Muslims had come here to steal and that their time in this country was running short. Jake Lang holds no office, but his words are not far from the ones spoken by people who do. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed won Michigan's Democratic Senate primary. Within hours, a sitting U.S. senator called him a terrorist. A sitting congresswoman called every Muslim holding public office in America a Trojan horse. Days later, the president was asked what Republicans should be doing to win in November.
Well, the one thing is we have jihadists being elected all over the place. We have this, whether it's communism, jihadism. It's a lot of friend of mine called up. He said, really, you should use the word jihadist because that's what's happening. And I'm not sure that anybody, if you take a look at what happens in other countries, I think that's not going to be necessarily the way we want to live.
Last year, the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, logged over 8,600 complaints nationwide, more than in any year since the group started counting in 1996. Here in Michigan, the chapter recorded nearly 500, also a record, up 25% from the year before. These are complaints people brought to an advocacy group, not hate crimes confirmed by police, but they're climbing, and they have been for 3 years running. Amy Doukoure is the lead staff attorney for CAIR-Michigan. The nonprofit is dedicated to combating anti-Muslim hate locally. Amy, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning. Thank you.
And we want to hear from you about this moment, how it's affecting you, your friends, your neighbors. Call in. The number is 313-577-1019. Amy, as I mentioned, Jake Lang isn't an elected official. He's a January 6th convict who was pardoned. And last Tuesday was at least his third trip to Dearborn. Is there a line running from what senators are saying in Washington to what happened in Dearborn?
I think that there's definitively evidence that it is being driven from, mainstream politicians, quite frankly. It's not a coincidence that you see this movement of like anti-immigrant, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim hate, and then you see that manifest itself on the ground with these types of invasions from agitators from out of the state who are not connected to our city, not connected to our community, who come here just to spew hate. I don't think that that's a coincidence.
You talk about agitators who are coming from afar, and specifically, of course, we're talking about Jake Lang, but he didn't come alone. His co-organizer was a Detroit pastor, Lorenzo Sewell. How much of this is actually coming from outside Metro Detroit?
From what we're seeing, it's a mix of coming from outside and from within. There's definitely, hate here in Michigan against the Arab and the Muslim community. However, people like the pastor are emboldened by those other people. There's also evidence that his rhetoric is specifically linked to these same mainstream politicians and directly amplified after, the winning of the nomination by Abdul El-Sayed.
So the agitators feel emboldened when people who have massive platforms, specifically we're talking about American lawmakers, come out and say some of the things that I discussed in the top here, using words like terrorist and jihadist. This is pushing these thoughts, this rhetoric into the mainstream.
Definitely it is. This anti-Muslim bigotry has become the last vestige of acceptable racism in America, quite frankly. And when you have people coming to do this type of activity and there's no legal consequences for that, and we're not talking about just, coming to protest or free speech. We're talking about people whose intent was to come here and threaten and humiliate and terrorize a community. If any other community had done that, had gotten together to invade an area, there would have been federal criminal charges. We saw that with what happened in Texas recently, where protesters against ICE were charged federally for organized crime. But instead, we have the police protecting them, we have like federal agents protecting them, and we have no real consequences because they are pushing a mainstream political agenda.
That's kind of wild to hear you say those words, that this is the last vestige of acceptable racism in the United States. I mean, what is it like for you to do this kind of work with that in mind?
It's right now is a very precarious time. It's very harrowing. We are on the forefront of this fight, and because of that, we get death threats to our office. The police were in our office 3 days last week, taking complaints, listening to messages, viewing hateful and violent videos that were sent to our office, just because we stand up for the rights of a marginalized community.
If I may point out, I mean, you're Muslim yourself. I'm wondering what it's been like for you.
Honestly, it's frightening, quite frankly, because people feel emboldened on the streets to make comments. They come to my inbox, they Google my cell phone number and call me late at night, early in the morning with messages. And I just can't imagine how other people are feeling. We are getting calls from everyday citizens who live in Dearborn who are being doxxed, who have had these agitators coming down through their neighborhood, vandalizing their community, turning over garbage cans and whatnot without any repercussions. And they're living in fear. People are living in fear. And I think that's sort of the intent of this movement, quite frankly.
I'm wondering how this is changing the way you're living, the way people you're speaking with who have become targets are living.
For me, it hasn't really changed the way that I live. I've sort of signed up for this fight. I'm a political figure. I'm out in the public. People know who I am. But it has changed the way that many Muslims are living. They're fearful to call the police. They're fearful to raise the alarm because they're afraid they're going to be further targeted by these people who have made their violent ideations known. So people are staying home, and I think that's the intent. The intent is really for the political wave that we saw running up to vote for more progressive candidates, hoping that they'll be afraid and stay home in the fall.
And this explains why Mayor Abdullah Hammoud, when he was on this show last week, made sure to emphasize something in particular, and that was live your life as you always have. So this is perhaps the strongest message that Muslim leaders right now feel like they can propagate.
I think it's a very powerful message. And I think it's very real because nothing ever changes with fear. Nothing ever changes or becomes better for people who shrink, right? We have to be able to walk our full identity, own our full Americanism. Like, it is very unpatriotic to take a portion of the Constitution and the reason why this country was founded and use that to ostracize a community. So we need to regain ownership of that and take our power back. And that's how things will get better.
That sounds hard when we think about what's happening on social media right now, where people feel even more emboldened to say things that they might not say to someone's face. Here's Dearborn Mayor Abdullah Hammoud discussing this on our show after Jake Lang came to town last week.
What they saw more than anything was the clickbait. They wanted to get into fights and arguments. They wanted to have screaming matches. They wanted to have altercations because that is how they monetize their hatred. They monetize it with more clicks. They fundraise off of this, and they get the shares, and they get somebody else to potentially act based on the videos that they saw with no context.
I have to point out that this is something I'm noticing quite a bit after We at WDET posted video clips of having Dr. Abdul El Sayed on the show after he won the primary, and after posting video clips of Mayor Abdullah Hammoud onto our social channels. Lots of vitriol is what I noticed. Lots of comments that, quite frankly, and I am, of course, a free speech defender, but these were comments that I just wanted to immediately delete and wipe off the face of this earth. How much is social media amplifying messages of hate right now?
I think social media is instrumental in amplifying hate messages, any message really, because the access to it is instant. The gratification from it is instant, and people hide behind anonymity. A lot of these profiles that you see are pseudonyms. They're not real names. They're not real images. So they feel safe. They feel protected to do this, because I am an ardent free speech defender. But free speech has real consequences when you say real ugly things. And on social media, there seems to be no consequence for those who are spewing hate, because the platform has no real incentive, because they're also monetizing it, right? They're for their own benefit. And it's definitely spreading it far and wide.
It's much more, in other words, about how long I'm going to spend reading through all these vitriolic comments. And if it happens to be a long time, then this is a win for big tech, for social media, the people who are running social media, I should say. I'm wondering, though, how much of this hate is real versus coming from bots, because I also will click on a person's profile and it's like someone or perhaps someone with 0 posts and 0 followers and a very random photo of a cat, and I'm wondering, is this even a real person?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that the bots are running these hate mills or any kind of mill, like just to amplify people's speech, it's a real thing. It's known, and they're doing it. But also, the bots are being paid by somebody who has either a racial or political ideology and agenda, and they're paying for this thing to happen, because the desired outcome comes from the reaction to those messages, or when people, like, the algorithm works where if you spend a lot of time looking at something, you see more and more and more of that, so then it becomes your reality. And I think that's the danger with these bot farms.
I wonder if you're having conversations like this with people who tell you how upset they are about what they're seeing on social media. Do you say, maybe spend less time focusing on that, and that's going to change the almighty algorithm for you?
Yeah, I think that's true, because not only are we consuming media that we agree with, we're consuming and internalizing all this hate media, right? Even if we don't agree with it, just because we've watched it. So I tell people, especially my children, I have children that are like 17 and 21 still living at home. I tell them, change what you're watching. Search for something exciting or fun or, motivating, instead of doom scrolling literally all day and consuming these things that are making you more fearful and making you, see the world in a negative light, because we don't have to visualize it like that.
I mean, I realize what we're talking about, social media and how it has been able to foment hate, is a newer phenomena. CAIR-Michigan and CAIR National have been documenting some of the highest incidents of discriminatory acts against Muslims. These are people reporting the acts. I'm wondering, let's just even set social media aside for a moment, how that Islamophobia itself is increasing, and not simply that people feel more comfortable reporting it.
So what we do know is that it's vastly underreported. We only get the reports of people who know our organization, who interact with our organization, or sort of pointed into our organization. But we hear of hate crimes. We hear of Islamophobia that's not happening. And our numbers are based on people who report to us and things that can be verified. So we get more reports than what are reported in our annual. We put out a civil rights report every year. We actually have more internal reports than that. Those are just the items that we're able to verify. So you can see that it's growing. You can see the number of political hearings or what's going on in other states with their elected officials. where they're ostracizing and othering the entire religion of Islam by calling them terrorists, labeling organizations as terrorist organizations for doing good work. It's fomented at this point that's the way that we're going, and that's causing real impact here on the ground.
I mean, an organization like yours is trying to be a data point for people in understanding Islamophobia, in understanding acts of hate and potential violence. I realize 2 governors have declared that work. Again, the Council on American Islamic Relations, your organization, a terrorist organization. Greg Abbott by proclamation in Texas, Ron DeSantis by executive order in Florida. Neither is a federal designation. Ken Paxton sued in February to stop CAIR's Texas chapters from operating. A federal judge blocked the Florida order in March, and DeSantis went to the legislature and got a new law. These things are happening outside of Michigan, but I'm still wondering, how is it affecting your office here and your work more broadly?
It affects the work because that type of designation, regardless of whether it's here or it's not here, it's a national organization, right? It carries a stigma with it, and our community feels stigmatized. The word terrorism is exclusively used for Muslims, despite the fact that we know that there are copious amounts of individuals and groups who act with the ideology to terrorize people, right? But it somehow became synonymous with the Muslim community. We've seen John James, who's running for governor, promise that on day one he will designate our organization as a terrorist organization simply because we called out his Islamophobic rhetoric over a religious processional in Dearborn a couple months ago. So it's definitively affecting our work, and that's why I say it's fomented. This is a political ideology that is being pushed by not just the far right, but even people who claim to be the moderate right.
We're going to trace a little bit of the roots of this in a moment. But before we do, for those who aren't Muslim or Arab and say that this may be a problem, but they're not impacted by it, what do you say to them?
I say that's historically, that's just not been the case. We see when people start othering a certain group of people, they go for the next one first. So it trickles down. It has like an impact on everybody. There were times where Polish people were not accepted in the United States, and Italian people were not accepted. Now there's an attack, a whole-scale attack on immigrants that are not from, what we consider to be like white Western European countries. And that's your neighbor, that's your pharmacist, that's your the person fixing your car, right? So they're trying to divide society based on an ethnic identity, and that will erode the foundation of what America has been founded on, and that is a societal ill.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Amy Doukoure. She's the lead staff attorney for CAIR-Michigan, the state chapter of the country's largest Muslim civil rights organization, and she litigates discrimination cases here. 3 weeks ago, Michigan Democrats nominated Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, who is Muslim, for the U.S. Senate. We're talking about the rise in Islamophobia previous to that win and since, and what it's meant for people in Metro Detroit. And we want to hear from you about this moment, how it's affecting you, your friends, your neighbors. Call in. The number is 313-577-1019. When we come back, how Republican leaders used to talk about Islam. Stay with us. It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. There's a rise in reporting of hate against Muslims. Last year, the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, logged over 8,600 complaints nationwide, more than in any year since the group started counting in 1996. Here in Michigan, the chapter counted nearly 500. also a record, up 25% from the year before. And now we're seeing a spike in anti-Muslim rhetoric from high-profile Republicans. So what we're trying to understand now is the impact of that language on Metro Detroit residents. My guest is Amy Doukoure. She's the lead staff attorney for CAIR-Michigan. The nonprofit is dedicated to combating anti-Muslim hate locally. And we want to hear from you about this moment. How is the rhetoric we've been discussing affecting you, your friends, your neighbors? Call in. The number is 313-577-1019. After 9/11, Amy, politicians were striking a different tone about Muslims. Here is then President George W. Bush speaking to reporters at a mosque.
These acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith. And it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that. The English translation is not as eloquent as the original Arabic, but let me quote from the Quran itself. In the long run, evil in the extreme will be the end of those who do evil. For that they rejected the signs of Allah and held them up to ridicule. The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace.
Former President George W. Bush speaking after 9/11 to reporters at a mosque. At that time, there were a lot of reports of Islamophobia, but the language from politicians seemed to be different, as evidenced by what we just heard. Is that how you understand the difference between then and now as well?
Yeah, so it's a lot different. There was a lot more talk back then about unity, about what made us similar as opposed to what made us dissimilar. And then you see this rise in xenophobia coming. And with that, you saw a lot of mainstream media, we're talking movies, televisions, who played up this stereotypical Muslim trope of terrorism. And then that became the mainstream ideology about who a Muslim was in the United States. And then we've seen certain politicians capitalize on that. They capitalized on the xenophobia of it. They have created this identity that Muslims are somehow an immigrant community inherently, and an immigrant community from a certain place in the Middle East. Let's be clear, and that's just not the case. Muslims have been here for generations and generations, third, fourth, fifth generation Muslims that are here. And but you can't monetize that. You can't capitalize on that. You can't take this ideology that people are coming from somewhere else to take something that you have and use that as a divisive wedge to prop yourself up with power. If you know, we're talking about how much we have in common.
Researchers who study this say it's the actual messaging, to your point, that is changing too, from terror threat to something more like a civilizational one. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I think, and I don't think this is currently, like in the climate we are now, it's unique to Muslims, right? They're talking about Muslims coming to take over political power. That's really what this is about. And if you listen to Jake Lang's words, it's about economic and political power that Muslims are having. But we saw this with the Catholics. What was the rhetoric against JFK when he took office? There was some talk about whether a Catholic could really be a president, right? And how that might, create this different movement. We saw it with Barack Obama and what happens when an African-American man becomes president and what kind of political power that demographic is now trying to take. And now we're talking about it like in relative terms to Muslims. Muslims are seen as an immigrant community. So how dare we come here and exercise our civic duty, our civic engagement, our political power, and our economic power to become full members of the society. They would like to see us remain as like second-class citizens that are, working behind the scenes, but not really engaging to have our political needs met. And I think that's what we're seeing going on right now.
What I'm wondering, Amy, it sounds to me like you're saying we've really taken some steps backwards, but I'm wondering at the same time, if we've also taken some steps forward. I mean, set the Jake Langs aside for a second. When you look at where we are now, do you think that people are more accepting today than they were, let's say, after 9/11?
I think definitely polling would show that, right? Like, even though there is this this anti-Muslim, anti-Arab movement, that is not the majority. The majority of people are like, we don't like this. This kind of grosses us out. We don't want to hear this. We don't want this to be in our politics. It's just that based on the way that the media cycle runs with, commercial news and social media news, the loudest voice gets heard. And those voices that are trying to divide this country are louder than the ones that are saying, let's pump the brakes and take a step back because this is not really who we are. So I think societally, the numbers are there to show that this is not acceptable. It's just that there is a very loud minority of people that are trying to create this division.
When you think about that loud minority, I mean, there's a long pattern of anti-Muslim incidents spiking when the U.S. is at war in the region, in the Middle East. Does your data bear that out?
I think the data bears that out. I think another thing that's going on right now is that when you are at war, you have to create an identity of the enemy. And even when that enemy is here, based on national origin or background, then that whatever, national identity you've created for the people that you're at war with trickles down to here as well. And that's kind of dangerous, quite frankly. But I also think that the data would bear out the fact that every time that there is a major election cycle, that this happens. There is an uptick in anti-Muslim rhetoric every general election, and when there have been very consequential midterm elections like we're in right now. So that's also something that needs to be taken into consideration.
When we think about candidates who are, let's say, deciding to be emboldened and kind of testing your theory, is my anti-Muslim rhetoric going to resonate with my constituents or not? I am thinking about one Republican senator who didn't join his colleagues in speaking the same rhetoric. I want to listen to Louisiana's Bill Cassidy on Face the Nation earlier this month. He was asked whether his party should condemn what its own members were saying about Muslims.
Every community has a bad apple, and every community has those people, my gosh, weren't they wonderful people. Now, my exposure has been to the wonderful people. I condemn those statements, and everybody should be treated as an individual. If somebody's awful, they should be treated as awful. But we shouldn't treat everybody as awful because somebody with whom they're identified may be awful, if you follow that.
Okay, so not actually a strong condemnation by Bill Cassidy there, but it's something. And he said that in August. In May, a couple months prior, he had already lost his own primary. Trump helped push him out. So he's gone in January. What does it tell you that the one Republican senator willing to say it out loud was already on his way out?
So I don't really think that this is like a party line issue, first of all. I think that our primary specifically set a very strong example, and other primaries from this election cycle have set a very strong example that people are not interested in that divisive politics. Almost all of the candidates, including here at home in our Democratic primary, who took a hard line with regards to dehumanizing and demoralizing the Muslims, they lost their primaries almost completely across the board. And I think it sends a very strong message that it doesn't matter if you're Republican or a Democrat or somewhere in the middle. People don't want to hear it, and they don't want to base their future on hate. And I think that's very inspiring.
I want to go to the phone lines. We have a caller from Farmington Hills. Ken, thanks for calling the Metro. What's on your mind?
Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the very thoughtful discussion. Although I'm a little disappointed that you don't have another person to offer some counterpoints. But I did have some questions. And the first is there some sort of a documented history of terrorism on the part of other groups that have come to the United States that may have been similar to the acts that have been committed in the name of Islam. And for example, when the person being interviewed indicated, well, Polish people weren't accepted in the United States initially, I wonder, were there attacks on churches that were committed by people from Poland? That would be my first question, and then I have another question after that.
Okay, Ken. So first, you're wondering here about acts of terrorism and the list essentially, and who has committed it by, let's say, ethnicity or religion?
I'm saying that in the name of whichever race has been identified as a new race to enter the country. I think you mentioned Polish. Polish people came to the country and said they weren't initially accepted, or Chinese, or Jews, or I don't know, name any minority group. And you had pointed out that when they came to the country initially, they were not accepted, and there was racism, and they were treated in a manner that was not very accepting. And what I'm saying is that there has actually been terrorist actions taken by Muslims or in the name of Islam in this country. And for that reason, Islamophobia isn't necessarily based entirely upon, paranoia. And I wanted to know if you can identify another group that similarly was treated, was ostracized, and they also actually did commit terrorist acts.
I'm going to hand the mic over to Amy to respond to that. But one thing I do want to point out is that the FBI has long identified white nationalists as domestic terror threats. And now, Amy.
So what I was going to say to that is we don't need to look from a group that came from outside the United States to see terrorism, because we do know that the FBI identifies that one of the largest threats to American civilization is white nationalism. We also see anti-Black racism, Jim Crow, 400 years of racism is like slavery, then 50 years of Jim Crow, and then the civil rights movement, and we still see that. We also see people like Timothy McVeigh, who inherently bombed a government building to engage in terror, right? But we don't see the way that Timothy McVeigh, who's an individual who did not act alone, he acted with a group of people. We don't see that group of people being put together as calling them, the entire people that they're from, as being terrorist organization. And that's the problem. We had a group of people who committed a bad act, and there's no denying that what they did was a bad act. It was horrific, right? But that doesn't mean the majority of the people that just because they have the same, religious ideology as them are the same as them. And that's the problem. People think that that's the religious ideology, and it's just not. But we don't see any other group of people that are committing acts of terrorism on U.S. soil being treated as a collective in the way that Muslims have, right? What about the KKK? They were a Christian group, but we don't treat all Christians as if they're the KKK, because they're just not. So we shouldn't be doing that to any other group.
Ken, are you still there? We'd love to hear what your other question is.
Sure. Well, first, let me respond to that. First response is that if you're talking about the white nationalists, they are justifiably a very scary group, and the same thing with the KKK, and I think everybody recognizes that. But I wasn't talking about the majority of the population and then a small militant group within it. I'm talking specifically to the point that was made by the person being interviewed, which is that other minority groups from the outside have come into the country and have been ostracized or not welcomed. And my point is that the only minority group that has come in and actually committed terrorist attacks, whether or not it was the whole group or a small portion of the group, those attacks actually did happen, was Islamic groups.
I'd have to push back on that, Ken, that is the only minority group that has committed these kinds of acts. I don't think that is accurate. Amy, go ahead.
Sure. So I would say, what about the Irish, the IRA? They've been here committing terrorist acts. What about the Irish mafia, the Polish mafia, the Bosnian mafia? There's a lot of different organizations. More than that, I'm not certain that we can pontificate about whether it's worse that a minority of a minority group, like a small faction of Muslims did something because they're a minority group who came here, as being inherently worse than a majority group of people who have the same bad actors, right? So we're talking about human beings. We're talking about collective punishment and collective blame. And it's not just because the people, and Muslims are not immigrants. Let's be 100% real. Muslims didn't come over here yesterday, last year, in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 80s. Muslims have been here since before 1920. We are not an immigrant group of people. We didn't just come over here. We were here along the same time the Irish came, the Italians came. And that's part of the problem, is that this racialized identity and collective blame only happens for minorities. The fact that we can sit here and admit that other groups are majority groups, but they have bad actors too, and we don't engage in collective blame as somehow that's okay because they're a majority group, that's problematic in and of itself.
Last Tuesday in Florida's 6th congressional district, Randy Fine won his primary with about 58%. He's compared Muslims to dogs. One of his opponents, Dan Bilzerian, ran an openly anti-Semitic campaign, and Republicans across the party condemned him for it by name. Nobody condemned Fine. What do you take from that difference?
Because, well, first of all, we know there's a lot of money in politics, and the money in politics sort of follows people who engage in anti-Muslim rhetoric. Like, let's be real, that's who's being funded. It was who was being funded here in Michigan. It's who's being funded across the country. Also, it speaks, that type of rhetoric speaks to a certain type of people, including those people that Randy Fine, utilized to win his primary, like, quite frankly. So,
do you worry that this is the future of our politics, where Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are a much more common part of our discourse from political leaders?
I mean, it's sure leaning that way, right? So, and the fact that we have a large amount of strong Muslim candidates running and winning right now is amplifying the fact that there are people who don't want that to take place. And it is, we have like systems in the United States, systems of oppression, systems that have been in place to keep certain people in power for a very long time. And when other people challenge that power, we see this type of rhetoric. And it's very true that the United States is becoming more pluralistic. We were promised pluralism from the inception of the United States, but the fact that we're actually living that in this moment now is threatening to a lot of people, and that's what this fear is. But the change is coming. We saw this coming out of the civil rights movement. The change is coming.
We have a caller on the line, Fred from Milford. What's on your mind?
Listening to the conversation, great conversation, by the way. The last question just kind of bothers me because there's somebody who's talking about who else came to this country with some kind of religious document and reads that document to support terrorism. That seems to be a very biased opinion, starting right off of the Muslims and saying they're the only ones that do this. Heck, the Christians marched across Europe to kill people in the Crusades. And the Jews were involved with terrorists in the Middle East when the whole issue of whether or not they were going to be able to take over Palestine. There are terrorists who quote from religious books, and it's like so often that it happens that they go to a religion to justify their domination of their fellow man. It's not complicated. Everybody, every group is a potential for hating the other group in the name of survival and in the name of their religion. And a lot of indoctrinated people based upon religion are threats to us. And I've been studying this stuff, and I'm 46 years a trial lawyer trying to ferret out bias and picking juries. Everybody's got to mind their own P's and their own Q's. Everybody's got to wake up. Everybody's got to understand every religious group and every organized group by color, race, creed, or otherwise is prone to striking out at the other in the name of survival. And thinking that they need to do it. So maybe I'm going off on a tangent.
Well, Fred, one question for you here. Do you think that these are the views of just the vocal minority, especially as, a trial lawyer who's tried to ferret out the bias when you're picking your jury members?
A vocal minority? No, I think there's a whole bunch of closeted people who are within that group too. For example, and race was the big issue after the insurrection in 1967. Picking juries in Detroit became very problematic. And we could always see that there was this underlying core of don't trust the other person. And I think it's tied into the amygdala part of the brain that says fight or flight and says we got to survive. And those people are of a different color than us, so we better watch out because they're going to be out to get us. It's just fear. And that's why I resent Donald Trump so much. He stokes his fear. He stokes his violence. He stokes his white nationalism. It's just one thing. If you want to be a religious person, fine. Then follow the golden rule.
Treat others as you'd like to be treated. Fred, thank you so much for calling the Metro. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to let you go and turn back to Amy. Dearborn police made 22 arrests the night of Jake Lang's protests. I want to end on that. Police reported no injuries, and city officials called it a win. They praised residents for showing restraint. What do you think of Dearborn's response?
I think the response was measured. It was what it needed to be. It kept the city from erupting into chaos from the beginning. I did think that it was a little odd that people came here with the idea, with what could be a federal criminal intent to terrorize an entire city of people, and attended a political event, which is the city council meeting, for the purpose of shutting other people down, which is terrorism by definition federally. And instead of, treating it that way, they gave Jake Lang and his people a police march through the city.
These hate marches continue to come to Dearborn. In the last 30 seconds we have here, what should local leaders be doing before the next one?
I think just, preparing our people to understand that this doesn't say anything about them. It says more about the people who are coming here. And that as long as we remain united on that, on hope, things will work out.
Amy Doukoure is the lead staff attorney for CAIR-Michigan. Amy, thank you so much for joining me on the Metro.
Thank you.
It's the Metro on WDET. We'll be right back.